Anybody has any questions about anything that we've covered, please feel free to send a line to the message box. If not, we're just going to go ahead and keep trucking along. I am going to open up that mesh refinement file again. And just to make sure that we're clear about that process, is here you can see in this grouped collection of elements, the refinement process. So if, for instance, you see that some of the meshes that you're making are not joining properly or smoothing the way that you had hoped, definitely make sure that the refinement process here is in place. This is going to be something that will ensure that your collection of mesh elements are composed correctly. The last element that we didn't look at here is the Unifying Normals, which really is the last kind of step, I guess you could say, in the refinement process. Now, here, where we have our three elements coming in, right? We have welded, but before we actually smooth, there is one last step, which is to unify normals. And the reason why I was holding back a moment before showing that is really because we need to understand a little bit more about meshes before that probably makes sense. Here you can see the breakdown of the mesh, and a mesh is composed, again, of faces, right? You have vertices. The vertices are what actually create the basic mesh elements. The vertex, at every vertex in a mesh, you also have a normal, so you have a vector, which is perpendicular at the vertex to the mesh. And you also, at the face, at the center of the face, have a normal or a vector perpendicular to the face. And so in addition to that, you can also embed color as well as texture into a mesh. So there's a lot you can do with a mesh. But in order for that to work properly, right, the mesh edit tools and the sequence that we described really needs to be taken advantage of in your workflow. So that last step, that unify normal step, is all about orientation. Now this is a really important thing to understand because orientation, not only will it affect the way that your primitive is smooth, but it will also have a really, I guess, a dire consequence if your meshes are not oriented properly when you go into 3D printing. So I think if you've ever 3D printed something, you've probably heard of the term watertight. That indicates that the mesh is rational and that the normals of all the basic elements are facing the same direction. So it means it's a valid or a rational mesh. But mesh orientation is really the way in which you construct an element of a mesh defined by the cyclical sequencing of its vertices. So when we saw this image here, and we saw that the quad and the tri, Q and T, are made up of the vertices with these indexes, the order that they're inputted is actually really important. So 4, 1, 3, 6. Now that makes sense because we want the quad to have these as its corners. However, that order also indicates the directionality of that mesh face or the orientation of that mesh face. So you can see here these arrows indicate the order that the vertices are inputted. Now, what this has to do with is the resulting normal. And this is a funny little rule. It's called the right-hand rule, but it's I think it works pretty well to understand what's going on. But if you take your hand, just make a fist and point your thumb at your nose. Use your right hand, and then open your hand slightly. Okay, and if you're looking at your fingers, you'll notice that your fingers are oriented counterclockwise, right? They're curved counterclockwise. And your thumb is pointing at your nose. So what this indicates is that if you enter the vertices of a basic element in a counterclockwise fashion, that your thumb, or the normal of that element, will always be facing out. Okay? And that's huge, because that means here that if you always reliably kind of have basic elements constructed as such, you can always ensure that the normals will be kind of facing out. But what if, for instance, you're working with some complex geometry, and it's not that easy to understand, for instance, whether or not you had constructed things all in the right order.